Come on now. Let's try this again, shall we? Happy Monday! I'm excited about this. I'm excited about this. The first time I saw Michael's face outside of a Zoom square was today. So I felt really good about that because, you know, we're all working still in a hybrid fashion and he wakes up early. I don't, so all of those things. My name is Christina Newman-Scott. I'm the executive director here at the Greene Space, and we're thrilled to have you. May I ask, who here are members who support double? Thank you. Wow, all over. Thank you. Normally I don't turn my head this. Double thank you to you guys. Your support really and truly allows us to do the incredible, important work that we do. And full disclosure, it's not an easy time for media. We know this. We read. But we're grateful to have you here, and we're going to have a lovely night. So before we start the show, I'm going to take a moment to thank some people and then tell you about some stuff. I put on my reading glasses that I started wearing during the pandemic. And now I own 55 of them because I like to spend money. And what I say to my husband is, do you want me to spend it on glasses that are $25 or shoes that are $350? And he's like, please buy more glasses. So I have 55 pairs of glasses. So we want to take a minute to thank our members. Thank you for your continued support. We also want to thank NPR and Penguin Random House for their collaboration. And I want to tell you about some really good programs coming up. On Wednesday, October 11th, we're going to have our Artist in Residence. And if you know our Artist in Residence program, you will want to pay attention to this. We're going to have the Mashup Americans. And their show explores what it means to live in the melting pot culture of the United States. They'll be joined by Min Jin Lee, author of Pachinko, to discuss what it feels like to be Korean at this epic moment of Koreanness. Who watches K-dramas? Thank you. Me and you, buddy. We'll talk about it later. Thank you for that, because I'm addicted. And they'll also sit with the internet's favorite astrologer. I don't want to mess up the pronunciation. I think it's Chani. Does anybody know Chani? Shani? Chani. Thank you. Chani Nichols to help navigate the stars and discover how our mashups come together. Then we're going to have a family concert with the Gateways Brass Collective on Saturday, October 21st at 11 a.m. that invites kids of all ages to meet the instruments and dance along to original music set to Ugandan folk tales. And, you know, you can always go to the Greene Space, www.greenspace.org, to learn more. Stay in touch with us. Donate over and over. Drink, then donate. Wash, rinse, repeat. We appreciate it. But without further ado, I'm so excited to invite my colleague, who we love here. We did steal her from NPR, sorry. But we love her so much. Her name is Kenya Young. She's the SVP of Studios, and she goes way back with Steve Inskeep, and she's going to tell you a little bit about that as she introduces the show. So join me in welcoming Kenya Young to our stage.
I can attest, she has 55 pairs of sunglasses. I don't think I've seen the same pair since I started working here a year ago. That's why I love her. So as Christina said, I'm Kenya Young. I'm the SVP, Senior Vice President of WNYC Studios. What does that mean? That's where our national programming is. That's where our podcasts are. And yes, before here, I was at NPR for 15 years. And I was one of Steve Inskeep's editor on Morning Edition. And I was Steve's executive producer many years later. So we do have a great history. We actually went to dinner beforehand. And can they hear us right now? Yes. Talking? Yeah. I didn't tell him that I was introing him. I kept it to myself the whole time. But it's so fun to do this because I watched Jackson Land happen, and I actually think I scheduled his book sabbatical for the second book. So to be here on his third and watch him take on this history that I'll talk about in a little bit. It's just great to see it come to fruition a third time. So it's a delight to be able to introduce this event. Michael, well, and then there's Michael Hill. There's both the morning editions in one spot. So Michael Hill, as you know, is the WNYC host of Morning Edition, an award-winning journalist and New Jersey native. He's reported the news all over the country. Yes, for New Jersey. I think it's, where do you think people told me I should relocate to when I come here? Where in New Jersey? Of course they did. That's all I've heard, Montclair or New Rochelle. So we're lucky to have him at New York Public Radio. He's reported news all over the country, and now he's reporting for us on Morning Edition here locally. And for the actual bio of Steve, not just a personal account, as the host of NPR's Morning Edition for almost 2 decades, Steve Inskeep has mastered the art of bridging divides. In his new book, Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, he explores 16 conversations that Abraham Lincoln had throughout his life that shaped the way he approached unifying the country. He told me a little bit about this device over dinner, so you guys are gonna love what you hear. It's so interesting how he made this come to be. So please join me in welcoming Michael and Steve to the stage.
It's really funny. I wrote Kenya a few days ago. I'm like, I'm doing this event. Would you like to come? So thank you.
Put you on the list.
She's like, no, I think I can get in. I think I can make it. But it's really, I know you're going to take over here. I'm sorry. But
No, go right ahead.
It's really awesome that Kenya is here. I have been at Morning Edition long enough to have worked with 6 executive producers. I have burned out 5. No, I hope not. But it's just been really a fantastic relationship. I have learned from each of you. I've learned something tremendous and different. And I think that you all talk to each other about how the heck to manage me, among other things, more important things than that, I'm sure. But thank you, Kenya. It's really great that you're here. Can I mention one other person who's here tonight? Jay Kernis is here, he reminded me the exact way to, the founding producer of Morning Edition. Stand up, Jay, it's way back there. Okay, he's not standing up. With his wife, Gwen, it's Gwen, right? Yes, awesome, glad that I remembered. Anyway, thank you guys for coming, it's really touching. Michael, please, I'm sorry I took over.
That's all right, my friend. It is good to see you all. Very good to see you. Thank you for coming out this evening. This is I'm not touting this book. It is a fascinating read. I want to tell you that now.
You can also tout it if you want to do that. No, go on.
I learned so much about Lincoln. I think history tends to look at Lincoln as this simple man, this simple figure to a certain extent, and he's really much more than that.
Go on.
Yeah, really, he's really much more than that. And some of the issues, and Steve and I will talk about this, some of the issues that we're dealing with now are some of the same issues I think that were being dealt with in the 1850s and the 1860s. Steve, I have to ask you, what prompted you to write this?
All of my books grow out of both my curiosity in history and the news that I'm covering every day. I end up trying to write history, write about the past. I don't want to completely mix it up and write about the present and pretend it's the past. But I go into the past to learn more about the news that I'm covering. And this, I'm glad that you found it different than the idea of Lincoln as a kind of simple figure. My mom, who also read this book, is touching, my mom read the book, said, I thought of him as someone who just kind of stumbled into the presidency by chance, and that it was kind of a miracle that he became president and that he was a good guy. But as my friend Noel King, who read some early drafts of this and commented, said to me, I previously thought that Lincoln succeeded because he was good. I now understand that Lincoln succeeded because he was smart. And in looking through his life, through a series of meetings with people who differed with him, different race, different gender, different background, different opinion, above all, disagreements of different kinds, in looking at those meetings, I felt it was an opportunity to see how he applied those smarts, how he practiced politics, how he tried to build coalitions to make the country a little or a lot better place, which I think was a vital skill in his divided time and is a vital skill in our divided time.
You know, immigration was a big issue back in 1850s, 1860s, people talking about it. It caused people to separate and have divided lines. Of course, slavery did too.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of parallels I look at now to a certain extent and see the, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I want to raise a third parallel, and that is that human nature is about the same now as it was then. We're all human beings. They were human beings. We're in the same country. We're walking the same ground. In some cases, we're in the same buildings. One of the great privileges of my job is I get to walk around Washington and sometimes go see someone at the White House or in the Capitol. So Lincoln was trying to figure out how to engage human beings to improve the country. And you just mentioned two issues, immigration and slavery. And I realized that those two issues have something in common, or did have something in common at that time, in that in each case, there were people who were most affected, enslaved people, immigrants, and then there were people who had power, citizens who were voters, who in America at that time, almost entirely white electorate. And that made it a political challenge, particularly for Lincoln, because according to my research, Lincoln believed that people were primarily motivated by self-interest. They would look after themselves. And ultimately, you could trace almost anything they did, even if it was patriotic, even if it was altruistic, it would go back to some kind of self-interest. That is a bit of a grim view of human nature, but Lincoln thought it's how it was, and he tried to turn it for good. And then his challenge became, how do I persuade people that slavery is not in their self-interest? People, I mean, the country's divided in the 1850s. There are southern states that embrace slavery. There are northern states where it's been banned. Everybody is touched really by it in some way, but if you're in a northern state, you never see it, or you very rarely see it. You don't have a personal connection to it. You maybe don't know what it means to you. You don't know how you're affected by it. And Lincoln's challenge was, how do I persuade that person who feels he has no particular interest in this, or even thinks it's kind of good, that in fact it's bad?
How did you do it?
He framed arguments that told white voters what was in it for them, even when he's talking about slavery. And once I realized the thing about self-interest, those arguments became clear to me. He would say, slavery, if you're not careful, is going to expand from the South into states like yours, like ours, and it's going to interfere with free labor. It's going to affect you. Slavery is a global embarrassment that makes a mockery of America's pretensions as a beacon of liberty. Americans were proud then, as they are proud now, of the United States as a free country that can be an example to the world, and slavery was something that was well known around the world that made that something of a joke. And Lincoln told white voters that. This is embarrassing for you. And he also, when he talked about the enslaved, he would put it in terms that white voters could relate to. He would say, a black woman has the same right to be paid for her labor as I do, or you do. And this is an era, like any era, where people were trying to make a living, where in fact there were labor disputes, there were strikes. Lincoln was in favor of the right to strike, by the way. People were arguing these issues in their own lives, and so Lincoln would talk about slavery in terms that meant something to the electorate that had to be moved.
You know, Steve, today I heard, with this whole potential government shutdown that we went through over the weekend, and the House Speaker finally drew in Democrats to get something done to avert the government from shutting down Saturday night. And I heard today one of the members of Congress who first spoke on the floor and then came outside the Capitol and said, really demonized the Speaker of the House and said, you know, he worked with the other party. He worked with the Democrats. He did this. He went against our agreement in January and so forth. And I just, as I heard this, I was thinking of the time of Lincoln and the time of now and saying, well, isn't that what the speaker should do? He's not being elected to Congress as a Republican to do Republican work. He's there for the people.
Yeah.
And so it made me think about Lincoln and the time of Lincoln and how he succeeded. In this particular environment right now, how would Abraham Lincoln survive?
Okay, so first he would have these like bracelets that would say WWLD. What would Lincoln do? Second, I do want to express my gratitude to the United States Congress because I've got this book. It comes out tomorrow, and it's about bridging differences and the difficulty of that. And so they had this little drama over the weekend of showing what that's all about. So it was very nice of them to do that and to keep the government open in the end, at least a little bit. I really appreciate what you say about like someone criticizing the Speaker of the House for going over to the other side or working with the other side. It is a curious situation where the overwhelming majority of Congress is clearly in favor of some kind of agreement to keep the government open and do their job. But the partisan dynamics are such that it becomes a major controversial issue if the Speaker of the House defies a small minority of his own party. And it would seem, I mean, I don't want to say as a journalist, McCarthy did the right thing, but let's just put it this way. McCarthy did the normal thing. McCarthy did the traditional thing. Make a deal and get the bill passed and work out the rest of it later. I mean, that is the way that democracy works. It's never over. Nobody ever wins completely or forever. There's always another debate. There's always another election. And that can be very frustrating. So what you do is you get everything you can in this election, and then you go fight the next election if there's some more that you want to try to get out of that situation. I think that Lincoln's example does tell us something about that time because he was continuously reaching out to people who disagreed with him, even on profound moral issues like slavery itself. He was continually seeking allies, like you mentioned immigration. Lincoln really disagreed with people who opposed immigration to this country. There were these anti-immigrant societies that rose and gained great power in his time. And Lincoln said, if these people ever get control of the country, I'd rather move to some place that makes no pretense of loving liberty, like Russia, for instance. This is literally what he said. I posted that letter once on Twitter, and all these people were like, no, you made that up. He really wrote that. But Lincoln reached out to these people whose views he despised and tried to get their votes because some of them agreed with him about slavery. He was dealing with all kinds of people and trying to build a coalition. Now we have to add something really important here because to state the obvious, Lincoln didn't end up agreeing or making a deal with everyone.
Right.
There was a little war. I mean, he was elected President of the United States as an anti-slavery candidate who acknowledged, by the way, that it would be impossible for him to abolish slavery under the Constitution as it was then. He said, I'm not actually going to violate your constitutional rights to own human beings, but I insist on saying that you are wrong. And that was enough for a large part of the country to say, we don't accept this, we're out of here, we're going to secede. And in the end, the South started the Civil War explicitly to preserve slavery. So you can't bridge every divide. But Lincoln's challenge in that circumstance was to build a broad enough and powerful enough coalition of the majority to govern the country and uphold the Constitution, and that is what he did.
Steve, I want to congratulate you on Differ We Must.
Wow, thank you.
You're welcome. I want to take questions from the audience here. I know you have questions for what time we go to bed, how early we get up, what we do, what our routines are, and so forth. So
very important
we're open to
questions.
that. Anybody have a question for us? Anybody?
We got him going a little soon. Should we talk for a little while until someone
Sure.
comes up? Oh, no, here's someone. Why don't you say your name so that
Okay,
we get
my
to-
name is Mary Zulek, and there is so much written about Lincoln. There's so many amazing things. Did you try to read all of that? How did you?
Yep, all
Really?
18,000 books.
Okay.
I had heard there were 15,000 books about Lincoln, but it's an outdated number. The other night I got to share a stage with Christina Schutt, who is the executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. She's like, yeah, 18,000. 18,000 books. That's a lot of books. So, no, I did not read them all. I have read about Abraham Lincoln all my life. I grew up in Indiana, which is where Lincoln spent most of his youth. And you learn a lot about Lincoln when you grow up in Indiana. I'm sure that's true in a lot of states, but it's especially true in Indiana. My brothers and I played with Lincoln logs. Then there was this amazing coincidence, like, wow, this guy is also on the penny. And, you know, the 5, it's just amazing. And you like see, I don't know if kids still see film strips in school. I'm sure they don't. But we saw film strips about Abraham Lincoln growing up. I mean, there's an incredible story of his youth, which maybe you know. This man was born in Kentucky. His family moved to Indiana. They were basically living on a farm that they hacked out of the woods. They were, by our standards, extraordinarily poor. When Lincoln was under 10 years old, his mother died of a mysterious disease. And from the time of 7, he was wielding an axe to help his father hack down the trees on this farm. He spent the next 15 years or so doing manual labor. He had less than a year of formal education, and yet he learned everything that he could. He learned by reading every book he could get his hands on, and he also learned about people. I'm getting around, by the way, to answer your question. He learned about people. And there are accounts of this from his stepmother, among others, that he would intensively observe people. Grown-ups would come to the cabin to talk to his parents, and he would sit there quietly listening to everything. And then when they left, he'd begin asking questions about everything, about every single thing, down to the smallest thing she said about what everything meant. He was learning about people and storing away this knowledge that he would use later as a grown-up, as a politician, which we view as a dirty word, but it was his calling, and it's what he did and did well. So I've learned all my life about Lincoln and have always had Lincoln books around the house. I still have a book that belonged to my mom, the Reader's Digest condensed version of Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln. The original was 6 volumes. They cut it down to 1 giant volume that is beautifully published with the reverence of a family Bible. There is so much to read about Lincoln. There's an enormous number of scholars. I did read everything that I possibly could and drew on scores of books that I've just read for pleasure throughout my whole life. I feel that I found a lot of things that are new and characters that I never knew about. However, because there are 18,000 Lincoln books, I have to make a relatively limited claim. I do not take the risk of claiming that there are new things in my book. I do claim there are many things that were new to me. And I feel that this book also is new in a way because of the moment in which it is published. It is a story of the past that I tried to get straight as a story of the past, but I believe that it speaks to now. Go ahead, man.
Just right here.
You talked about differences with the electorate, or I mean the general public. I've read that he also populated his cabinet with people who disagreed with him to some extent, people who had been his opponents in the elections.
Yes.
He disagreed with his generals sometimes. Generals said, we're going to do something, and then they sat around for 6 months and didn't do anything.
Yeah.
I wondered, does your book talk about those differences?
And in one instance, I was talking to Steve about this, General McClellan, we spoke about, who just, and it's well detailed in the book, just openly defying Lincoln's orders. Almost every order Lincoln gave him, he defied it.
Yeah. McClellan was a very talented, very young, but insecure general who seemed unwilling to take the president's instructions and work with them. He constantly demanded more troops that Lincoln didn't necessarily have to send him. He constantly defied Lincoln's plans. It's great because, like, a lot of his letters were saved. There's a book of McClellan's letters that seems like it's about that thick. And they include letters to his wife, where he describes meeting with the president and members of his cabinet. And one of the letters just says, "The president is an idiot." And there's another one, actually very early on, where McClellan has just been given this great command. He's a young man, he's in his 30s, he's been raised up through the ranks to command the biggest and most important of all the armies. And he's like, "It's really strange," he says to his wife. "It's almost like they believe in me. Like, what's going on here?" That didn't work very well for Lincoln, and Lincoln struggled with this guy. You are correct that he struggled with members of his cabinet. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a very influential book called Team of Rivals that gets into this and became the basis of the movie Lincoln. That is one aspect of Lincoln's political challenge. The members of his cabinet at least fundamentally agreed on what to do. They were mostly, not entirely, members of the same party. He put some Democrats in his Republican cabinet from time to time. They, however, mostly agreed, or all agreed, that slavery was bad, all agreed that the Union should prevail, and so they were kind of on the same page, but their personal ambitions clashed. And that was the genius of Lincoln that Doris Kearns Goodwin explores. When you get into someone like McClellan, it gets harder and trickier, because this is a guy with certain talents, with certain personality defects also, and a fundamental belief that was different from Lincoln's. McClellan was a guy from the North. He was a guy from the Free State of Pennsylvania. He had an elite education. He was a prodigy. He went to the University of Pennsylvania at 13. He then went on to the West Point Military Academy shortly before his 16th birthday. They had to give him a special dispensation to start so soon. Tremendously smart and talented guy. But at West Point, he was kind of an elite guy, so he hung out with the other elite guys at West Point who happened to be Southerners. And he absorbed their ideas of slavery and of society. And he wouldn't go so far as to say he was in favor of slavery, but he just really wasn't interested in doing anything about it. And this put him on a different page from the president, who also, for political reasons, was being very limited in his attacks on slavery, but was coming around as the war went on to the idea that it needed to be attacked, that the labor force of the rebels needed to be freed. That was leading to the Emancipation Proclamation. McClellan gave the president a memo basically saying the opposite. We should not interfere with the social relations of the rebels. He's got a phrase, something like that. I mean, it's basically a phrase you would hear from slave owners. This is the relations of society. We should not interfere with the relations of servitude. That is the phrase that was used. Lincoln was monumentally frustrated by this man because he didn't follow orders, because they didn't agree politically on the war, but in the end he got value out of him. His administration maneuvered McClellan out of his command, but then a crisis came and Lincoln needed a general, and McClellan was the guy, and he reached out to McClellan and put him in command one more time, and McClellan won his greatest victory, really his only clear victory, the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, which was a big enough victory to set the stage for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So one of the people who inadvertently helped to get the Emancipation Proclamation out in the world is a guy who didn't believe in it, never believed in it, and in his memoirs, decades after the war, never mentioned it. And I think that that says something about what kind of a president Lincoln was. He used that man for the good. Oh,
Yes, sir.
go.
Hello, Brian Fix. I wanted to go back to your earlier point about Lincoln in the log cabin and probing for information from his neighbors and
Sure.
whatever. How did Lincoln approach, and how would he approach today, folks who have a bit of a closed mind without much of intellectual curiosity? How do you open their
Are there
minds?
such people?
Not at all. How do you open someone's mind and get them thinking about things they don't want to think about?
Well, Lincoln would first think about it from the other person's point of view. I said the thing about self-interest. Another way, maybe a kinder way to put that, is empathy. How does the world, if I'm sitting here, how does the world look to you? Maybe I would take a minute and think about that. How does the world look to my friend Jay over here? What is it that he needs out of this situation? And I might find some common ground there. Part of empathy also may be understanding that the other person has very strongly held convictions that they're not going to give up. Many of us in America are frustrated right now, maybe you're among them, because we feel, I can't change the other person's mind. They're listening to propaganda, they're completely deluded, they're just gonna throw fake facts at me, or if I prove their point wrong, they're just gonna go back to the beginning and repeat it, which is a very frustrating thing that does happen in arguments. But one of the things that I realized in studying Lincoln's 16 encounters is he often didn't change someone's mind, but he figured out how to deal with them as they were. And maybe out of the 10 things that are important, we agree on one. So we're going to deal with each other on the one, you know. I'm not going to persuade McClellan to change his mind about slavery, but I do know that McClellan wants to be a successful general, and so I'm going to put him in a position to actually do that, and we're going to do that deal. That sort of thing, which is a more limited way to approach debate and discussion, but more realistic. I mean, if we think about our ordinary lives, I mean, does anybody have a relative that is like, their politics are disturbing? People are like raising hands. Thank you very much. Like Thanksgiving is really uncomfortable, or whatever holidays you may celebrate, really uncomfortable. Think about that circumstance for a minute. So your crazy uncle, hypothetically, your uncle has this belief that he's had that's developed over time for 30 years, and he's been watching some television network with a name that sounds like an animal for 30 years. And you've got 2 hours with them over a holiday meal. Are you really going to change, his viewpoint? You're probably not. Like you just don't have enough engagement there to persuade him that his belief is made up, or that Trump really won in 2020 or whatever. And you may decide, as Lincoln discovered, there's nothing I can do with this person. But it may be there is something that you can work with this person on. There may be something, just making this, maybe something in the community where you agree. Maybe you agree about crime in New York City. Maybe you agree about infrastructure. Maybe you agree about gardening. I mean, it might be something that's a little off politics entirely, but you might have some space where you can relate to this person and get some value out of that relationship. Even if there are going to be things that you will just never agree on, at least not at this particular holiday dinner.
So how would he do that now? Because the sides are they're so polarized. I mean, like the example, the lawmaker today saying, shame on you for working with the other side.
Yeah, I mean, and that lawmaker, I assume, represents some of his constituents. That's what we're hearing by the lawmakers like Chip Roy or whatever. Some of the more intransigent lawmakers will say, I am representing what my people want. I represent this district in Texas or wherever it is, and I'm representing what they want. I'm not 100% sure that's true in their district even. I mean, right. The loudest voices in their district are saying that. The talk radio is telling them that. The internet is telling them that. But real people may be a little different. But even let's suppose that's true. We cannot expect, and in fact should not expect, everyone to agree in a democracy. If everybody agreed, it would be some kind of totalitarian state. It would be creepy if everyone agreed. So it's, in fact, all right that Chip Roy or whoever, somebody from maybe our point of view or your point of view is out there and utterly wrong. The objective of democracy is not to get everyone to agree. The objective is not to get everyone to unite, because it is a free society. The objective in a democracy is to get a majority for what is right, or the best approximation of right that we can manage today. And if we can't get all the way there, we'll have another election in another year, and we'll discuss it some more. So I acknowledge that we hit roadblocks. But that example of the House of Representatives is an interesting one, because it seems clear from their voting that a vast majority of lawmakers knew what they wanted to do, and it was to do their normal business. And then it becomes their job of how to apply that majority in the way that it should.
Good. The lady back here.
My name is Jane Tillman Irving. I am interested in the fact that Steven Spielberg made an entire movie about Lincoln without mentioning Frederick Douglass. So I trust you do. I have not read your book.
Yes.
But what is your take on the influence of Frederick Douglass on Lincoln and the abolition of slavery?
Thank you. First, I will answer your question that of all the characters in the book, other than Lincoln, Frederick Douglass appears the most. And I think that is right, because he's a gigantic historical figure. He is maybe Lincoln's only rival for the greatest American of the 19th century. He was the most photographed American, apparently, of the 19th century. My friend Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor of The Atlantic, which I recommend to you if you do not subscribe, by the way, it's a really good magazine, believes that they are the two greatest Americans, period. Douglass is really important. I do feel the need, just for a moment, to clarify for anybody who needs the clarification that there are two Douglasses in this period, and it's very confusing. There's Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery and became a writer and orator and activist. And then there's Stephen A. Douglass, whose politics were slightly different in that he profited from his wife's inherited slave plantation, but became a very powerful and important senator from the state of Illinois. And it's Stephen Douglass who debates Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's Frederick Douglass who tells off Lincoln continuously, year after year after year after year, while also being his ally. He is one of the most famous characters in this whole story, or one of the most fascinating characters in this story, I should say, for that reason. Douglass was a man who had a voice. He was very well known. He had his own newspaper. He was even more famous thanks to conservative editors who would mention him all the time and say that the Republicans and other white anti-slavery leaders were following this black man's agenda. That was the kind of smear. I mean, we could think of black leaders today that are basically used the same way, you know, I mean, or people of color. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is way more famous on Fox News probably than on MSNBC. I'm speculating, but I mean, I even counted the number of minutes on screen. But Douglass was famous. He was very well known. And from the beginning of the Civil War, understood that the way to win the Civil War was to free the enslaved labor of the rebels. He's got an article from like April of 1861 where he says war for the preservation of slavery, which is what it was, must be met with war for the destruction of slavery. And Lincoln took his time. He was slow to do that for a variety of reasons, one of them being that there were some slave interests, slave owners, and slave states that remained loyal to the Union, and he needed them as part of his broad majority. So he was not ready for a year and a half to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And during all of this period, Douglass is disappointed and finds it terrible and a waste. And he describes Lincoln publicly for his tardiness, for his vacillating policy. He says that Lincoln represents Negro hatred. That's a quote, a phrase from a Frederick Douglass article about Abraham Lincoln. And yet at the same time, this is the brilliance of the guy, he was politically pragmatic as Lincoln was. He understood that there was a need for a broad coalition. He had decided years before that he would support the Republican Party even though it did not go far enough against slavery because they could get something done. And so he was a kind of loyal opposition. When the Emancipation Proclamation came, it did not free everyone who was enslaved. It freed people in rebel-held areas who, of course, couldn't even be liberated right away because the rebels were in control. But it was going to lead to millions of people being freed. And Douglass understood that it would end slavery, period. He said January 1st, 1863 was the greatest day in the history of man because of that proclamation. And after it came out, the Union began enlisting black soldiers in the Army, adding to the Union's manpower advantage. Douglass became a recruiter, in effect, for the Union Army, encouraging black men to enlist, but became frustrated that they did not receive equal treatment. And I think probably the longest chapter is about Douglass's decision to go to Washington to protest to the President of the United States, because Lincoln had made a liar out of him, he felt. He had promised these black soldiers equal treatment and they weren't getting it, and he was going to talk to Lincoln about it, and Lincoln took the meeting.
Yes, back here, but was the Emancipation Proclamation, the fine print of it, that wasn't Lincoln's idea, was it? Wasn't like Fremont who came out a year before?
Well, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation,
Right.
but you're exactly right that other people had the idea previously. There was a Union general, John Charles Fremont,
Yes.
who in 1861 declared a kind of Emancipation Proclamation for the state where he commanded, or for the region where he commanded. It was focused on the state of Missouri, a slave state that was loyal to the Union, but had a lot of people in it who were fighting for or favoring the rebellion. And Fremont, very early in the war, declared freedom for the enslaved laborers, for the slaves of rebels, and also said that he would have shot anyone who was discovered in arms behind Union lines. And Lincoln did say, wait a minute. And Lincoln's objection was, first, politically, I'm trying to keep these slave states in the Union, so I need to wait a little while to do what is right here. But second, that's not your job to make this political decision. You are a military officer, and I need you to follow my orders and back off a little bit. And instead of obey, because as we heard, Lincoln had a lot of generals who just really kind of wanted to do their own thing, Fremont decided to protest. General Fremont was busy fighting, so he couldn't come back to Washington to object himself, and so he sent his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, who was herself an outsized character and one of a number of women who had been around Washington at one time or another who had great influence. And she was perhaps the most influential and most outspoken of them all, and also very famous. And she went and protested to Lincoln, and that is another of the meetings in this book.
Yes, back here.
Hi, my name is Sally. Some politicians have very interesting relationships with the press today. Did Lincoln make use of the press, and if so, how?
The word interesting is doing a lot of work there. Yeah, I think about Lincoln's communication strategy a lot. He did interviews. He would talk directly with reporters, not that often, and that was a very rare thing. And as Jay Kernus knows, the TV technology was not then what it is now. I don't mean to imply, Jay, that you were around at that time. Just that Jay knows a lot about television. Yes, he would use the media, he would use the press. As a matter of fact, in his earlier days, he wrote newspaper articles. He would not sign them, which was normal. Like most newspaper articles wouldn't have somebody's name attached necessarily. Sometimes they were satirical newspaper articles. In fact, he once wrote a newspaper article mocking a political opponent so severely that the opponent challenged him to a duel. And Lincoln, this is one of the great stories about Lincoln in my view. Like Lincoln, they do this negotiation, there's a whole formality of duels and dueling culture, like, Hamilton Burr and pistols at 20 paces and the whole deal. But Lincoln was challenged and he had an opportunity to choose the weapon. So you could choose this pistol or that pistol. He says, he really doesn't want to do this duel. He says, I choose 5-foot-long cavalry broadswords. And we have to stand on either side of a board on the ground and hack each other. And if anybody goes over the board, they can't go over the board on pain of death. sounds kind of awful, doesn't it? Like you could, with the pistols, you could hope the other guy misses. With the sword, what are you going to do? In the end, they negotiated it away, and Lincoln did not write so many satirical articles after that. But he remained very interested in the media. His friend William Herndon said Lincoln never passed over or ignored a newspaper man who had an opportunity to say a good or bad thing about him. Mm-hmm. He paid attention to newspaper reporters. There are accounts of him as president-elect. He has an office in Springfield where he lived. He's waiting to go to Washington to become president, and there are just hundreds of people coming to see him, all kinds of people coming to talk with him. And this newspaper reporter, who is a German immigrant, shows up, and Lincoln's like, yeah, just sit over there. And like hundreds of people are coming to see him, and he's just sitting there watching Lincoln all that he wants to watch him. I mean, if Biden did that, that'd be kind of cool. I'd just like sit in the corner of the Oval Office and see who comes and goes. And he understood how to make his point in the media. I'll make one more point about this and then stop. Lincoln was massively criticized in the media. He was criticized by conservatives for being a dictator during the war. He was criticized by abolitionists and more progressive people for moving too slowly. He was criticized for military strategy. He was criticized for everything continuously. And most of those attacks, unlike some political figures today, he would let them pass. Mm-hmm. They didn't matter to him. I mean, Frederick Douglass is attacking him as a racist in print, and he's like, yeah, come on over, let's talk. I mean, he was trying to just deal with people and let go of what they said. But he would respond when he thought there was some value in it, when he could get some value out of the exchange. In 1862, Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, a famous newspaper editor of the time who had been very influential in the Republican Party, printed this open letter to Lincoln saying, you're screwing up this war, and one of the things you're failing to do is an Emancipation Proclamation. You're just not getting it done. This is terrible. And he had no idea that at that time Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation and was waiting for McClellan, the terrible general, to win some victory so that they could like play off of good news and issue the Emancipation Proclamation and not look desperate. So that was what Lincoln knew, but Greeley didn't know that and publicly attacked him. Lincoln responded with an open letter of his own to Greeley. He had it published in a different newspaper, which must have enraged Greeley. But it's a very polite letter, and he says, if your letter has an impatient and dictatorial tone, I'll ignore that, even though he just mentioned it. And he goes on to state his strategy in the war. He says, I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. If I could do that by freeing every slave, I would do that. If I could do that by freeing no slaves, I would do that. If I could do that by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. My job is to save the Union. And what Lincoln had done there are many ways to read that letter. I mean, one way to read that letter is saying he didn't care about slavery. I think he did care about slavery. What he was doing was preparing the public for the Emancipation Proclamation he was about to issue. He was giving the fundamental reason that he would free millions of enslaved people, to save the Union, which was the broadest possible, most popular possible reason to do it. He was giving that rationale to the public so they would be prepared for what he was going to do really just a few weeks later. He used a controversy with the media in order to make that point.
Somebody else? Right here? Steve, would you like to read a page or two? From
Oh, I can do that.
Sure.
Well, do you want to take...
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Barbara Lerman-Gollum. I think he also, he wrote under a pseudonym too, a woman's name, if I recall. I read something, it was, and before he got in trouble with that dueling.
Oh, there are two
right?
newspaper articles. It's not a pseudonym,
Yeah.
but one of them Lincoln wrote, and the other is believed to have been written by his then fiancée, Mary Todd.
Oh, okay.
And hers was a little sharper, but yeah.
So, as a fellow Indiana
All right.
person, no, I'm not. I'm saying you and Lincoln.
Oh.
Well, I'm thinking about.
I was prepared to just be really
sorry.
welcoming.
No, who's your?
I welcome you anyway.
Bill, thank you. What what really you think built his character? I mean, he was incredibly tolerant. That was part of like who he was.
Yes.
He was tolerant of, you talked about immigration before, of different religions. I mean, he was really way ahead of his time at that time. So, what do you think? His family, I know his family was very influential, and anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question fully. It's hard to get inside this man's head. For all those thousands of books that we mentioned, the 18,000 books, it's hard to get into his head. He was a very careful writer. He was a very careful speaker. He only showed the world what he wanted to show them. There are bursts of humanity that do come through. He seems like a very relatable person, but even as he's relatable, he is mysterious, and of course he was assassinated, so he didn't live to write a memoir or tell us anything more. With that said, it seems to me that he took advantage of the circumstances that he had that were very common. It was very common to live on the frontier. It was very common to be poor. It was very common to grow up on a farm. It was very common to work with manual labor. But he had this curiosity and this desire and this ambition. Let me just pause and mention the word ambition for a moment, if I can. It's a word that is kind of a bad word, in the same way that politician is considered a bad word. I'll even note that my late colleague, Cokie Roberts, informed me that ambition is considered an especially bad word for women. You're not supposed to be ambitious. Well, Lincoln's life tells us that you can be ambitious, and it's good. It seems to me that he had curiosity and ambition. He wanted to make something of himself, and so he used the tools that were available, which is a phrase that he used later in a different context. We must use the tools that we have. He used the books that were available to him, and they weren't, as far as I can tell, particularly great or amazing books, but he read them, and he learned how to read, and he learned how to write, and he also used and learned from the people around him. And that was a very rich source of learning, because in a democracy, you need to understand every kind of person. So his ambition drove him. His sense of the long term, I think, made him patient. I don't want to say he believed everything would work out, because he's often described, I think properly, as a fatalist. He sometimes felt that everything was fated to be the way that it was going to turn out, and it was just really up to us to discover how it was all going to turn out. But that also gave him a kind of calm, and gave him a kind of long-term perspective that allowed him to wait. I speculate here, and I'm not the only person to so speculate, his marriage also may have helped him in a way, because it was a very difficult marriage. Mary Todd was a famously self-centered, temperamental, and probably mentally ill person who was very difficult to deal with. Lincoln himself, I think it is fair to presume, was not the best or easiest husband to deal with. He was always off traveling. He was always off meeting people. He was always dealing with politics and with the law. But that marriage also forced him to have forbearance and patience and think about the long term, the very set of skills that he needed to deal with difficult people like General McClellan.
Yes, go ahead. Steve, would you like to read from
Is now at the time that I should do that? I can do that if you want.
Sure.
Is it okay if I read something? I thought I would read. Actually, it gets to the matter of self-interest. Wow, this is an interesting book. Who wrote this? I just want to come back to the theme of Lincoln's understanding of humanity. And this will underline something that we discussed just a little bit before and gets to a little bit of research on it. In all that he said and did, he considered his audience, making calculations based on a straightforward understanding of human nature. He told his friend and law partner, William Herndon, that people acted entirely out of self-interest, that even their most loving, patriotic, or altruistic deeds were meant to bring them some benefit or pleasure. As president, he said, all people look to their self-interest, unless among those deficient of intellect, everybody you trade with makes something. So he talked with them about it. In letters and speeches, he used the word interest far more often than liberty, freedom, or moral, and referred often to people's motive, by which he meant their self-interest. He embraced the spoils system in which election winners distributed government jobs to political supporters. That was fine with him. And he appealed to the white electorate's self-interest against slavery in the way that we discussed earlier. It still mattered to him how people pursued their interests. He said they could act out of moral sense and self-interest, aligning their interests with a higher purpose, and this book is the story of his effort to do that. He navigated between rocks of political reality while trying not to lose sight of his moral compass, which is the central struggle of this book.
And can't we identify now that what we're seeing in politics, that it has a lot to do with people tapping into their self-interest or their party's interest or those types of things that motivate them?
I think it has to do with the way that arguments are conceived for people. Leadership has a lot to do with it. How does someone construct your self-interest for you, or which parts of your, what of the various things you might try that you think would advance you, who persuades you to try option A as opposed to option B? The discussion we had about the House of Representatives seems relevant here.
Yeah.
How do House Republicans see their interests? They would like to get reelected. They do need to listen to various activist groups. They need to listen to various financial interests. They presumably have some kind of loyalty or allegiance to one another. And they also want, like, attention. There's a kind of attention economy, like who gets attention on social media, who gets a hit on Fox News, who gets a hit on Newsmax. And the way that people calculate their interests leaves them with a lot of different choices. And one of the challenges of leadership today, as was true then, is can we get a majority of people on the same page to move the country in what we feel is the right direction, or at least not move backward?
Good. Sir?
My name is Mark, and so I know Lincoln had a thriving or long law practice.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, to what extent his success in politics, his ability to persuade, his work was informed by, attributed to his legal practice, his experience there. And before you answer,
Yeah.
I am a lawyer, so
Okay.
and secondly, a small confession: I'm curious about when both of you wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night.
Okay. We'll do that one in just a moment. I'll be brief on this. The lawyer is another one of those words like politics and ambition that can be double-edged for some people, right? In Lincoln's case, he believed in the law. He believed in the rule of law, and he was really into logic. And you can understand, like, his arguments and his speeches are often exercises in logic. It is really interesting. He could give a 3-hour speech about slavery, and he did this. And he did not do the thing necessarily that you would expect someone to do giving a speech today. Tell a personal story. Let me tell you a story about Jimmy, this little boy that I met on a southern, whatever, like something like that. He would not tell that kind of story. He would say, let me explain to you why this is wrong and why this practice contradicts with the Declaration of Independence and everything we pretend this country stands for. It was an exercise in logic. He's got a thing known as, I think, the fragment on slavery, which is just a little logical problem. And he's like, any reason that person A can use to enslave person B could also be turned against person A. Mm-hmm. You say that that person should be a slave because he has darker skin. Okay, the first person with a lighter complexion than you can come and enslave you. I mean, it's just exercises in logic, and that clearly comes from his study of the law and the study of the courts. I will add one other point on this, though. He seems to have been a clever lawyer, although his friend and law partner, William Herndon, who saw him practice, argued that he was a rather indifferent lawyer, a little bit sloppy and really interested in other things.
Back here? Yes.
So I just want to pivot a little bit. Sorry, I hate microphones. My name is Valerie Valentine. I wanted to pivot a little bit, listening to another person's question about journalists and
Ooh, we can get to the waking up thing
yes,
here soon. Go on.
I'm
yes.
intensely, as a person who's really hates waking up in the morning, I don't know how Mr. Hill does it. But as a journalist, I've heard you interview politicians many times. And
Thank you for listening.
there's times where I've heard just a touch of frustration, maybe with a politician who's expressing a point of view. Social worker at training, I'm sorry, I just picked those things up. But what is your thought processes when you're doing an interview and you're talking to a politician, and as to how far to push when you may not agree personally, but you're a journalist and you're trying to be balanced, and how far to push and when to let go of what's being said, because what's being said may be disingenuous or may not exactly, line up with logic. So,
I want to get enough out of the person that I can understand at least what their point of view is. Even if I feel it's bogus, at least I want to understand what their argument is. And particularly if it is live, I want the audience to be able to understand what their point of view is. And if, as you suggest in this kind of example, it's someone who is being disingenuous or not telling the whole truth, I don't need to go, liar, liar, but I want to ask the questions in such a way that the audience has information and they can make their own judgment that that was, what is the word that we can't use on the air? Starts with a B. Nonsense. Thank you. That's a good substitute. And so, I mean, I push as hard as I can. I think that I frustrate some people sometimes because they're like, you didn't call him out on his obvious lies. You just told me that you listened and could tell he was lying.
Right. Yep.
Therefore, I would suggest I may have done my job. But that's my goal. I want you to understand this person for who they are, or at least a little bit of them, as much as I can get in this interview. It's not about me. It's not about me announcing my views. It's about you figuring them out. And it doesn't matter if it is a far left activist or a far right activist or Abraham Lincoln. It just I want to get at what is going on there. And sometimes I will repeat a question several times. Once someone hung up on me in an interview last year. Can't remember his name. But I mean, there was a congressman once who told me to get the F out of his office, and he used the word. And sometimes that happens, but I try to be courteous. I'm going to tell a story, if it's okay, about someone I will not name, but I suppose you could go find them. I interviewed this person, and it was a recorded interview, but we played a lot of it on the air. And I was listening to the studio with Michelle Martin, who is one of my co-hosts. Is Michelle Martin awesome? Yes, there we go. Yeah. And Layla Fadel and A. Martinez, they're just great. So I'm in the studio with Michelle Martin, and this interview is playing. And we are talking about whether this person endorsed lies about the Iraq War. And I think his point was, I endorsed things that I believed were true at the time, even though they turned out not to be true. But he doesn't exactly say that, because this guy is a lawyer and very, very clever. And so he says, well, if you're going to say that what we said and were lies, I'd have to say that they're just lies all the time on NPR, meaning that deluded people talk on NPR all the time. So we're going on this interview, and I followed up on that, and I just said, if you hear something that you think is false on NPR, call me up and let me know. And he said, I don't have time. And at the end of the interview, I said to him, I say goodbye to people, and I say, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. And Michelle Martin turned to me and she said, I just heard a lie on NPR. We didn't do the hours. Should we do the hours?
After this
okay,
question,
okay.
right
Yes,
here.
sir. Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Hi,
Hi, my name's Ashley. So some of the positive characteristics that you talk about Lincoln, about willing to surround himself with people of differing opinions and willing to put in the time to find the places that they agree and build from there. Are there people since Lincoln, politicians, journalists, personalities, that you've seen some of those same characteristics?
Yeah, I mean, there's one aspect of that I wanna build on a little bit, and it has to do with practical politics versus idealism. We talked earlier about Frederick Douglass. That relationship, I think, was really important. I think we can argue that Lincoln doing less than the maximum against slavery was politically necessary, but it was also necessary for somebody to call it out and say, that's not enough, that's wrong, we need to do better, we need to go farther. Both of those roles were important. And in more recent times, I can think of examples of that. I can think of Martin Luther King in the March on Washington in 1863, warning against what he called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Don't just give me a little bit of change, I need a lot. I need equality, I need it all. And in that same period, there was a Republican senator from Illinois named Everett Dirksen, who was rounding up votes for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And part of that process for Dirksen was practical politics. I have some concerns about this bill. I have some objections to this bill. We need to propose an amendment to this bill. Now, what Dirksen was doing was taking a bill that he already supported and trying to figure out ways to get some more conservative senators to sign on so it would have enough votes. You needed the Martin Luther King voice, and you also needed the practical politician. In more recent times, you could look at someone like Barack Obama, who is fascinating because he's the first black president. He is, in some ways, the revolutionary figure because of his identity, but he was playing the role of the practical politician from Illinois. And there were often progressives saying, why don't you go farther? What's the matter with you? Why haven't you endorsed gay marriage? Various things that he had not done in the early years of his administration, and certain things he didn't do ever. And that interplay is really important in our politics. Without saying that he succeeds or not, because we judge day by day, I think President Biden is attempting to embrace that kind of politics, that sort of give and take, that practical movement forward as far as he can, and then maybe doing less than some people would demand that he do. And there are Republicans who have attempted that kind of practical politics, although at the moment, a very large part of that party is just going in a different direction.
Quickly right here, yes. Last question.
Caroline, it's so unusual for a politician to admit that they're wrong today, that they're sorry, that they made a mistake, or even that they just changed their position. Did Lincoln ever do any of these things and acknowledge explicitly?
This is a funny thing to say, given that it's all about working with other people. I think that he rarely did. In the matter of the duel, there was a careful, almost United Nations style negotiation because Lincoln did not want to admit that he was wrong to write the nasty article. And he also felt insulted by the way that he'd been challenged to a duel. But the other guy didn't want to admit that he'd been rude in challenging Lincoln to a duel. And so they negotiated something where Lincoln said he did not intend to harm this man's reputation. He had written the article only for, quote, political effect. Which in a way is kind of meaningful. It's like, it's politics, it's not serious, it's something else. Lincoln did not change his mind often. In fact, one of the things he said to Frederick Douglass was, I may be very slow in reaching a conclusion, but I'm not going to step back once I make it. And in his meeting with Frederick Douglass, he acknowledged, in a way getting to your thing about being wrong, he acknowledged he had been slow. He acknowledged there was some truth to that argument. But Douglass understood him also to say that having arrived at the Emancipation Proclamation, he would never go back. We still haven't said the hours.
One of the things.
What time do you get up in the morning? Do you not want to answer that question? I'm sorry, you go on. You're the moderator.
No. I typically, I'm awake. No, really, I'm typically awake by 2:30, 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning. I am. I'm used to it. My daughter knows that. I'm usually awake that time. I typically go to bed 8:15, 8:30 the latest at night, and sometimes even on weekends it's the same. I don't sleep a very long time, and once I get up and I'm awake, my mind is going, and even if it's 1:30, it's hard to go back to sleep sometime. And at 4 o'clock, whatever I just said, get up and stretch, exercise, do something like that.
You exercise at 4 o'clock in the morning?
My producer will tell you I used to actually work out in the morning. I mean, a full-blown workout at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
But now I'd like, you know what, I'd rather sleep a little bit longer now.
Well, good for you.
So it's good.
Good for you. Good for
And
you.
then how about you?
Okay, so I get up typically about 3 o'clock in the morning. I try to be into work by 4 o'clock in the morning, and the show begins at 5 a.m. Eastern Time on the 2nd without exception. I try to go to bed at 8, so in theory I get 7 hours of sleep.
Wow.
In theory. In reality, I have a family. I'm a father of 3 daughters, and so they take some time. And it would not be fair many evenings for me to go to bed at 8 and leave my wife, Carolee, with everything that needs to be done. So I do what I can, and some nights it's 9, and occasionally it's 10. But I'm lucky in that I have multiple co-hosts now. Right. For the first several years of the show that I've now done for more than 19 years, it was Renee Montagne and me. And we resolved that one of us would always be there, including holidays, Christmas, New Year's, didn't matter. At least one of us would always be there for you. And that was really tiring. And if that were still the case, I'd be dead at this point. But I'm fortunate that we've kind of expanded the crew, and so there's a little bit of a rotation, and I'm able to get days off the show and spend them reporting. A couple weeks ago, I was off the show and was able to use that time coming up to New York City a couple of times to talk to all 4 of the talking heads in the same room, and Volodymyr Zelensky, and the wife of the president of Iran. I mean, you can decide which of those is more interesting. But I was able to do all of those things while, like, rested, and it was nice. So it's every day is different. And that's maybe, I don't know if you feel the same way, like doing Morning Edition is energizing. Journalism is energizing. Events are interesting, people are interesting, and it wakes me up every day.
My producer, Alec Hamilton, back here told me when I started the show, she said it's like a hamster on a treadmill. And it is constantly, I mean, from 5 o'clock on, it's an adrenaline rush. And usually about 7:30, 7:45, things tend to be in place, and you've gone through a lot of the content, and it's much easier at that point, so it seems. But it is, I feel like I get a workout. I don't have to physically do, I do get a workout.
So you still are getting a workout?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Steve Inskeep, it has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Same.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank you all, too, for your great questions, for your input, and for listening to Morning Edition and WNYC. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.